Okay, for those on the line, sorry for the delay. We're missing one or two people who were on the line. I've emailed the governing board with the link to this meeting. Hopefully they can join in over time. We have about 40 minutes. Well, there's going to be a steering committee meeting and a strategy meeting. For your perspective, the steering committee and the strategy meeting are both open to anyone to attend. The steering committee, it will have vote or potential vote on our standards. The strategy session is just a chat. So for instance, Dave from Qualcomm and Kubota-san from Sony began to chat about AI, and our strategy session is where a chat like that can continue. Because these are open, it allows the community, if they wish, to dial in and to see how we work, right? The community doesn't get a vote on our steering committee, which is the formal mechanism for approving new standards, but they can see how it works and audit us on how do we build a standard? How do we judge if something is going to be released as a standard? The strategy session, likewise, is mostly the board taking extra time outside of formal meeting to discuss the future. And it's a way for the community to see how the top level official decision makers do that. Right now, we have one guest who's here, Alex from SecTrend. Welcome, Alex. So SecTrend is a Chinese company providing tooling SCA. They're pretty big in China. They've got a lot of clients, including international clients in China. And they're looking at going international to Japan and potentially into the Western world as well. So, this is, I think, the first time we've had a Chinese SCA company at a strategy meeting, which is good because we've got some knowledge into, let's say, providers from the US or Europe, but obviously we want to make sure that we know the world's supply chain solutions. So really good to have you here, Alex.
Do I need to introduce myself?
Sure, you can have a self-intro if you want.
It's my honor to come here to come with you guys. And actually, this is the first time I also attend international meetings from open source and be a speaker here. Let me introduce myself. I'm the founder and CEO of Shanghai SecTrend Information Technology. We provide some program analysis tools, including software, some conversation analysis, including banner analysis, including static analysis tools. But our flagship tools is our SCA tools for the managing open source compliance and security. And we have some many big enterprise customers in China, like Tencent, like Baidu, like Alibaba. So every day, over tens of thousands of developers use our tools to make the scanner for their code base, maybe over 10,000 times for each meet. And we also have some very big enterprise customers like Xiaomi, like Vivo, like Oppo, this consumer electronic manufacturer. And we also have some, supply chain of Japanese automotive manufacturer like Toyota, like Honda. They have some tier 1 or tier 2 manufacturer or supplier supply chain in China. So that's why I come here, that I will to learn directly from you guys about how you manage the open source compliance and security. What is the best practice in Japan to manage open source compliance? And also, I would like to promote the communication between China and Japan. And I would like to come here more and more, and maybe more friends here. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And we will be relying on you also to hopefully take back to your clients a picture of how we work, how this project works in discussing the future of our standards and how we talk about strategy. So hopefully you can explain to them, maybe companies we haven't reached yet, how something like this international organization works and how welcome they are to join us as
Yeah.
well. So with that note, we're going to have our steering committee meeting. The steering committee is the formal way that the project votes on standards. So our steering committee in practice is our governing board again. And the steering committee votes on community development on standards. So the community can make an update to an existing standard, or they can make a new specification and they can send it to the steering committee, and the steering committee says, yes, no, or maybe. And that's the formal way that I guess you could say, the formal way that we ensure that a specification matches our project charter, that it matches our business. This allows anyone in the world to contribute to proposals, but it allows a known group with a known process to approve or not approve the proposals. So we balance having a really open community with having a coherent, auditable process for taking community energy and approving it or not. That is important because we build things like ISO standards. And when we finish a standard that will become an ISO standard, we need to make sure that it is aligning with existing standardization, that we can send it into ISO confident that we have created this and reviewed it in a way that makes sense. For your reference, the steering committee is going to look at some proposals today. If you approve the proposal, then it goes into a formal process of a freeze period, public comment period, and so on and so forth. That's very similar to every other standardization org. If you do not approve something, then it doesn't go into that formal process with a public freeze period in preparation for submission to ISO or being endorsed as an official OpenChain standard. If you look at something and think that has potential, but not today, or that has potential, it should have changes, then that steering committee guidance goes back to the community and they continue work. So the options are, yes, we love it, goes into a formal process, becomes an OpenChain specification, and then potentially in the future becomes an ISO standard. No, we hate it. Okay, it stopped. Or maybe with comments, and it goes back to the community. This steering committee has worked essentially like it is today. Most of the time we don't have outside observers, and that's just because no one turns up because people find this part boring. The steering committee is the board voting what we do. And we have some items, our business of the day. Our specification work group, our global community, has been exploring updates to our two ISO standards, ISO 5230 for license compliance and 18974 for security. They have some material ready for us to look at in that context. There are also other ideas of completely new specifications that they're talking about, or our special interest groups are talking about, but that stuff is not ready to go to the steering committee yet. It's at the community discussion point. In other words, at this juncture, our community is talking about some other stuff. They're talking about contribution processes. They're talking about SBOM quality, but neither of those conversations have progressed to the point where anyone has a specification they want to put in front of the steering committee to get approval as an official OpenChain standard at this juncture. So the stuff that's on the table today are updates to licensing and security. Actually, those are the most important things by far. Those are ISO standards. If we update this stuff, it impacts the market for years. The proposed license specification update. We have been in market since 2020 on the license spec as an ISO standard. As an industry standard, this version has been in market since 2019. So it's been in market roughly 5 years as a de facto standard. It's been in market just over 3 years or so as an ISO standard. We've had comments in that time period. People have had ideas. And the question for us is, where do we go with those comments? Our specification work group has been reviewing the comments for 1 year, since November 2022. They've been incorporating them in a draft for update, and that draft is formally now submitted to the steering committee for review. On the slides that are being shared, or on the paper material in front of you, the second from last page, you'll find links to the license specification current version and the 3rd generation draft. Now, essentially, the question to the steering committee is, has anyone had a chance to look at those? Yes or no? Does anyone have any objection to that update? Yes or no? And bear in mind, part of that could be someone read the draft and said, there's something here I hate, or part of it could be purely strategic, and someone wants to say, the proposal to update the licensing standard suits me or doesn't suit me for reason X, Y, Z. So I just want to pause here and see if anyone has any comments to the proposal regarding updating the license specification that came in from our specification work group. They have some updates that they've incorporated based on the last 4 years in market. And nothing earth-shaking, but they've put some stuff in to clarify or improve language. Are there any comments or suggestions on the language, or comments or suggestions on the concept of updating this ISO standard? Mary.
The comment on the updating is, I've been participating in some of the meetings to create these clarifications, so I don't think there's anything controversial here. But do we have a plan for like a certain cadence for updating? Like once every 5 years is pretty typical.
A great point. So Mary was just asking, do we have a cadence plan? And you've been on quite a few calls, as you pointed out, for updates. There's nothing big in this draft per se, but do we have a cadence or a rough guideline? The board can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we've socialized, though not formalized, the idea that a roughly 5-year cadence makes sense, because we don't want to iterate standards too quickly, because it takes ages to get them through the procurement cycle.
It can also look as if it's more unstable than other standards. If you have a good quality standard, make sure that message is good.
That's a very good point. So the stability question, which has I think been long term, how do we look credible? So Mary was pointing out that the cadence can affect the optics of stability. Question to you: do you think, for example, the 5-year cadence is suitable? Is it something that you might be interested in the steering committee potentially endorsing at this meeting, or is this more of a discussion point for you?
Well, I was thinking as we look at these proposals, they could go into the waiting period. It's unlikely that those will change in the next couple of years, but if they do, before we submit all the changes together of the 5, we could review them as they come in, or we could review them all at once at that.
Question for clarification on the cadence. Are we referring to the cadence of 5 years since publication in ISO, or 5 years since we put it on the market?
General manager says, I don't know. So Jimmy was asking, should the cadence be based on the ISO release or based on our release as a specification? That matters because we release first as an industry standard, And after that, it goes into ISO through a transposition or conversion process into an ISO standard. So our release of the de facto standard is usually out there a year or so before the ISO standard. So if our cadence was 5 years from us, the renewal of license compliance would be next year. If our cadence was 5 years from ISO, the renewal of license compliance would be 2025.
Well, if we do decide to wait until the 2024, see what the AI study group has to say about whether the current specification make it, if needed, if there's any sort of clarification or update involving AI components, that would be good time to develop the changes.
So I'd like to put it, Mary was saying that the leeway of, for instance, putting 5 years from ISO might give us time to deal with, do we read correctly on new market developments like AI or not? So that would be responsive to current market situation, as well as, how to put it? Yeah, as well as the, tradition, as well as the idea of having a cadence for cadence sake. Right now, the market could perhaps benefit from looking at transition. So I guess the question is, oh, sorry.
Because I think that's in this 5 years is a problem that's okay. We get the 5 years, we reevaluate anything, but then to make it happen, it took more time.
Takes more time.
So maybe we can do it in a different way. You do 3 years to evaluation this ones and prepare for the next 2 to actually release. So we have a kind of a buffer to know that our evaluation is correct, and then we are already preparing to publish. So we don't lose time and you reach the 5 years limit.
Interesting. So Helio is suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we would actually finish the spec, but give it a long lead time before submission. So that would change our freeze period from like 45 days before we release our industry version and then submit that to ISO, which would take a couple of months. That would change our freeze period into a long period of a year or 2 years for comments or market development and reset.
This is based on the what happens is like with the security one. It took like a 1 year long until they reach from the approval to get published. So we need to have something like this.
So I comment to that. I like the 5-year cadence cycle from ISO release. It gives sort of a nice view in ISO with 2020, 2025, 2030. We provide certainty to the market. I like the idea raised by Mary of let's approve things as we move along, so that we have a large batch of approved changes. But I'm personally not fond of the 2-year release freeze. I think it's probably better that up until we can have a suitable time, but that we can actually make changes up until the end of that period, the end of that 5-year period when we need to submit it to ISO.
We not need technically a release freeze. We can do changes at the time of this frame, but we're already prepared that if something really goes wrong, we have time buffer to correct until we reach the 5 years.
Okay.
It's not like in a completely freeze and
Okay,
just
that's a good clarification.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, what Jimmy and Helio were saying there is that a balanced kind of freeze plus comments period that runs long could be beneficial, but a long freeze period could allow the market, summarizing, market to move beyond us. So it sounds like then the steering committee feedback seems to be that pending no objections to licensing, it sounds like the license draft sounds good, but maybe we want to then say, this sounds great. We're going to do a public comment period on that throughout 2024. So the edit period has been done for over a year based on material that was collected for 2 years before that. And that
just to discuss about the procedural things, I just want to make clear that the future goal of the OpenChain specification itself, because specification is just at the beginning, as they said, it's not like a minimum requirement, and just And so adding something to the specification means that adding burden to the all the participants in the supply chain. And and in terms of strategy, just there's just an existing specification, and there's a siblings specification. So just it's optional, and so you can just conformance of the original OpenChain specification, and you can just add a sibling conformance at the same time. There's another way, and so just the future strategy of just adding this OpenChain specification itself to contribution. What is based on the strategy or just a future goal? Because the OpenChain is just like a good reference model. And now the reputation is just going when the OpenChain values adding. But if you just add just contribution things into the original specification, it's good. But it also means that the burden or just it's not that's a little bit different from the reference sharing information to the OpenChain and the reducing cost and related to reducing risks. It's just a little bit different from the contribution itself. It's like a model case or just a reference document and just an original OpenChain specification. And so just it's another option of just making siblings
Yes.
standardization or just make it just not an international standardization, but just like an OpenChain document or something. And so we'd like to confirm that what the future goal or just a strategy for one of the.
So Osaki-san, just to summarize for the call, was saying that having a strategic goal for where our spec or specs go is pretty important. For instance, allowing our license compliance spec to add lots of new stuff would become burdensome. And then we have the thing of, do we want to build out a family of specifications? Do we want to do something else? The current answer is that the board and the previous steering committee period suggested that a monolith, building out something heavier and heavier, making a spec with a lot of material and potential modules, didn't work for the board before. And that's why we ended up with the security spec as a sister standard to licensing. That's actually different to the original proposal from our first specification chair. He wanted one standard with license module, security module, export control module. And our board and steering committee decided no, we would have sister standards and we would approve them one by one to decide, do the sister standards match our vision and mission? And to keep each one simple, so that if you adopted one, like 5230 for licensing, you wouldn't get confused that you also have to adopt 18974 for security. You could, but they're not the same standard. So the current stance is that if we're going to increase scope across multiple domains, or let's say make a contribution thing or make an AI thing, our current model is that would be a sister standard. That's the current consensus. The steering committee can change this if they want, but that's the current consensus. Keep it simple, keep it minimal. If you want to do something more, propose it as a sister standard, and then the steering committee will say yes or no. Meanwhile, in the editing cycle for the community, they can propose anything they want. And then at the steering committee side, we catch it and decide yes, no, or change it.
Yeah, but it's procedural and just strategy with always the process.
So that, I think, goes back to the vision point, that it should read on our vision and mission. Any proposal that comes before us should be ready to be read against our vision and mission. And the steering committee should look at any proposal from the community, look at our vision and mission and think, does this match? And if it didn't match, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if it didn't match, that would be an automatic refusal. But if it did match, then the question would be, it matches, is it a good idea for us at this point in time? But essentially then everything comes back to, the steering committee and the board decide. They can vote yes or no, or maybe come back later. But that flexibility, I think, Osaki-san, is a burden for the steering committee and board to make that decision, but it's an intentional burden, so the board can evolve. And the board can always stop anything, but that means the board can get new ideas as well. So for instance, we honestly never really talked about, let's say, making an SBOM quality spec way back when. We didn't even think of that. But now it's here and we're beginning to think maybe that's something we'll talk about. So we sort of let ideas come all the way to steering committee, and then the steering committee, you have the burden to look at it and think, does that fit? And it's sort of your job to look at our project charter and to think, does it fit? And then make that decision. But we don't attempt to pre-decide what the community can propose to us. We allow them to propose what they will, and then we tell them that fits or it doesn't fit.
Okay, sorry, just point of order, since we are sort of over time from our board meeting, I'm asking if anyone would have a problem with us extending this meeting another half an hour so that we have time for the strategy session. Would that be okay with everyone here?
I have to leave at 12:15 for
Okay.
I'm happy for, this meeting.
If someone needs to leave, that's entirely understandable. It's over time, but so that those of us that are able stay and continue for the strategy discussion, if that's agreeable with everyone. And I said, if someone needs to leave for an appointment, that's entirely understandable and fine. But I'd like us, at least a few of us, to have time to cover the strategy topic as well.
Absolutely. And this maps with what happened last time, where a couple of people had to leave in strategy, but most of us could stay. I think what I'll do then is I'm going to move to security because this is relevant. That's our next page. Security has been locked as a spec since 2022. It's been released as an ISO standard, as ISO said on their website last month, though they still haven't put the document on their website, but we're published last month by ISO officially. Yet we're looking at an update. So we're looking at an update within 1 year. Why? Actually, that's got to do with ISO. JTC1, when we made this, asked us to socialize it before we went into the past transposition process, because JTC1 was looking at how they can work better with existing ISO committees. And as a courtesy, they wanted to take JTC1 past transposition submissions and show them to traditional ISO working groups. They asked us to help them out and to do that. So we did it. We went to JTC1 Working Group Subcommittee 27, ICT Security, showed them our stuff before we decided to submit it to ISO. And we said, does this conflict with anything you're doing? Do you have any editorial comments? And they mulled it over for a while and came back and said, it doesn't conflict with anything we're doing. Here's some editorial comments. And by the way, here's a ton of scope expansion ideas. So the ISO committee sent us a ton of ideas to expand our scope. For example, some of their participants wanted us to include other ISO standards in R1, presumably because they saw we're minimal viable product, and they were thinking they can link that into their work products, which are bigger. They had ideas of going beyond known vulnerabilities, where we started based on feedback from Lockheed Martin's fellow who is co-chairing our work group, who said, let's start with the minimum issue, known vulnerabilities. Anyway, Working Group Subcommittee 27 came back with a ton of scope suggestions. Obviously, we didn't want to rescope our spec because we want to go through a past transposition process, not a re-edit process. We want to take an industry standard and transpose it into an ISO standard. Neither us nor our JTC1 mentor wanted the transposition process to end up being a re-edit process. So we moved all of the ideas for scope expansions into the next iteration of our standard. We put them on GitHub and we said, okay, that's for the future. But it does mean that we had a ton of ideas, most of which we're saying no to, but we had a ton of ideas for expanding or changing the security standard. None of them contradicted anything we've done. I think what they were was in service for asking for more on our end to lead people into the bigger standards, the more complex standards that Working Group Subcommittee 27 was doing. Example of stuff we said no to, they said include other ISO standards in your ISO standard. And we said no, for the same reason we said no to making SPDX a requirement of our ISO standard. We do not stack standards. When you use one of our standards, it's easy to use another one. If you use our security standard, it's easy to use a standard from Working Group Subcommittee 27, but we don't make it a requirement. If we make things more complex, if we tie things into bundles of complexity, as Osaki-san said, it gets harder. So where they suggested tie things and make it complex, we said no. Where they suggested potentially increasing some of the scope, we've been saying maybe. Anyway, a little different to the license discussion. License discussion is us and our community. We actually have to consider an update to our security spec because we had comments in from this Working Group Subcommittee 27, and we said we'll deal with it in the next iteration. And the question is, do we keep them waiting for 5 years or do we move faster? Naturally, we don't want to annoy any part of ISO. So it's a little bit of a different question. For your reference, the proposed update to the security spec actually doesn't change it much. We have rejected most of the scope suggestions because we're just not ready to move beyond known vulnerabilities and make things more complex.
Would it affect the 6 people that have signed up for this previous standard?
A good question. It sounds bad when you say, would it affect 6 people if we update our ISO standard? Yes, it would. Yeah, it looks like the update to our security spec as it stands would have minimal impact to anyone. It's mostly slight process adjustment, and none of the companies that are conformant with our standard appear to be either slow moving or cost constrained in a slight adjustment. LG is probably the one that would be most likely to be slow moving, but their open source team is highly advanced and they have no problem with process adjustment. They haven't signaled any issues. BlackBerry, Kakao Bank are very fast moving. So we have no indication that updating would cause serious stressors. Possibly though, to Mary's point, I mean, any rapid update could make people think, is this reliable or not? So we're in a weird tension moment where a very traditional part of ISO is saying, hey, how about you iterate? And we're saying, but we want to be traditional. So it's a curious tension. It's an unusual one coming to our steering committee. We don't have to make a firm decision today, but it should be on your radar. We have a proposed update. Actually, it doesn't change much, but actually it's in response to tons of ideas for expansion from ISO. And actually the reason that's happening is because they thought it would be interesting to increase our scope to feed more into their standards. We already do, but they wanted to tie us into their standards. And we have a conundrum. Our ISO standard is, formally speaking, 6 days old, and we have an update on the table. If we do go into this as an update, I would suggest that what we do is we give it some time. It would be kind of a shame if we use the momentum of our ISO release to just say, by the way, it's changing right now, which is effectively saying, don't include this in any of your work or contracts. Maybe we can run with what came up a minute ago, that we say that update looks nice. let's give a really long period here for more public comments. Then we can go back to the ISO committee and say, hey, we've been reviewing your stuff and including it or rejecting it for this draft. And there's a public comment period. Welcome to come back. But we don't do anything to actually update it for a while. I wanted to flag that because it was very different from the conversation with licensing, which is much more self-contained. And I do have a suggestion to the steering committee. For licensing proposed update and security proposed update, I suggest that the guidance we give our community is based on this conversation. That's great. We like your work. What we're interested in doing is having a long public comment period throughout 2024. And that would mean that the steering committee would adjust our formal process to not change our process, but to make the public comment period much longer. So looking at this, we have a public comment period of 6 weeks. We have a public comment period of 30 days. And then that goes into a freeze period of 2 weeks. I'm proposing to the OpenChain steering committee, based on this conversation here, that we change the public comments period from 30 days into something a lot longer. You know, we change it into something like 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. And that means we go back to the spec teams and we say, look, what you're doing is valuable. It is good. We do like it, but we're going to increase the public comment period to give a lot more people a chance to talk about this before we convert it into a standard. So that means that 1 year of work isn't rejected, but it means we have that leeway that license compliance would probably update at least later in 2024. So it hits the 5-year mark. And security, we appease the ISO committee by saying, we hear you, we've been working on your stuff, and here's more chance to comment. And that way we don't iterate our ISO standard immediately, but we don't make it look like we're ignoring the fact that they sent us a ton of ideas and we were like, we'll do it later. Now, if we have a public comment period and a freeze period, maybe what we can do then, we make the public comment period 6 months, and that would take us halfway through 2024. And then we take the freeze period longer, where no more comments, but you can scream if there's something insane here. Yeah.
Just make it clear that the standard is just a means for the open chain project and not the open chain itself. And it's
Yeah.
a very good chance of cadence of every 5 years, and there's a momentum. And also there's a comment of the expansion from ISO people, and there's a procedure of a public comment or something. But it's related to what we should focus on or what we should evolve. And so the thing that we are discussing is not the editorial things that we set the review period or just making a conclusion, but just related one for the open chain project itself. Now we are now under the situation that the board is not agree on the what will be the future of the open chain project itself, and so it's not that good timing to just make the editorial thing to the open chain and specification that ISO standard itself. But it's a very good comment from the ISO people, and so just introducing those comments to just the open chain bonds itself, and the big good resource for the discussion, not for the specifications evolution, but the open chain project itself, the activity for just what we should do. And because all we have is that open chain's branding. Is it just a review or just another badge that we can trust, like a certain party confirmation or something. And so it's very strict. So we should be very cautious about thinking about strategy.
Of course. And just for those on the line, Osaki-san was saying that this stuff goes beyond editorial. We also need to consider how it reads against our vision and mission. And when something like scope suggestions come in from, let's say, ISO that we're looking at, we need to consider those carefully against vision and mission. And just to clarify one point that I think might help, after the public comment period and the freeze period, and we're talking about making this longer. So after that, it comes back again to you for a vote. So as we look at what's going to be in the public comment period, which is it's finished, any last comments? And then we look at the freeze period, which is, okay, no more comments, just fires. The steering committee has all of that point to relook at the document and say, this makes sense on our vision and mission. And then the steering committee gets it right back here and can say that didn't read, no, or take this out. So in this sense, we should be getting the culmination of all of the suggestions to again review and approve. So today's discussion doesn't require us to lock our approval into the standard. What we can do is say, we like where you're going. Let's do a longer public review period in future. Let's do a longer freeze period, and then we'll look again and make sure that everyone is happy. So my proposal is that the public comment period changes from 30 days into something longer, and the freeze period gets a bit longer too, which would allow us to hit around 5 years on license compliance, and potentially then over a year on security, and presumably we might then say security looks done, but we're going to hold it for another couple of years for procurement or whatever. That's a decision for later. So the proposal on the table is the public comment period changes from 30 days into, say, 6 months, and freeze period changes from 2 weeks into a longer period as well.
Sorry, to add to that, I'm still worried about market communication. So I would like us to communicate that we're not gonna, our cadence is targeting 5 years. We're not gonna make an update more often than 5 years for licensing compliance. I think we can have a different approach to security, since that's a fast-moving target or an area. So I think that we can have a different narrative, but I still think that we need some continuity. So communicate 3 years might be something. I don't think we need to communicate about security right now, but at least for license compliance, if we seem to have consensus, 5 years is a good mark, then it would be good for us to communicate to the market that we're aiming for an update every 5 years.
Okay. In that case, Jimmy was just saying the 5-year cadence makes sense to him. So how about we put this to the steering committee and see if you today. Public comment period, 6 months. Freeze period, 2 or 3 months. Communicated cadence of update, target 5. Subnote, security is fast moving. Steering committee will have a look at it again in Q1, Q2, and come back with timing on that because it's a fast. Yeah. So public comment period, 6 months. Freeze period, 2 or 3 months. Target cadence, 5 years. And security is fast moving. We'll come back to you on that in Q1 or Q2. And that way, I'm sorry. The web application has been depreciated. We've moved to online questionnaires. All of that's updated and already done on the website. And if we update a new version of the specs, it's no problem to make a new version of those. And people can use the old or the new version, depending on which one they're mapping to. this would be very similar to ISO 9001, where it's actually ISO 9001, I think 1998, 9001, 2005 or something. So you would just choose the variant in the year you're conforming to. So our infrastructure is in place, whatever the steering committee decides.
So, Shane, I have a quick question there. Just looking at the timelines that you just proposed, 6 months public comment period followed by a freeze period you're looking at is about 3 months, let's assume, right? So that pretty much almost like 3/4, essentially 3/4 that will consume for these like public comments plus freeze. And then the overall cadence for the 5-year cadence, assuming that that still is in place, approximately that's going to give us every year maybe a one full cycle, right, of getting all the public comments and essentially getting through the freeze period and potentially retaining that, or is it like at the end of that every year cycle, like approximately that 9-month cycle, are we intending to make any sub version changes, or is it just going to be is the proposal is just going to stay there that okay, we'll just freeze it for 3 months after the public comment period and not effect any changes to the actual specification that's out there?
So the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, would we be looking at having a pretty strong lockdown on development of the specs during the public comment and especially the freeze period? And would we be looking at any subversions? And I think the subversion thing actually sort of fits into the SPDX model where they have the ISO standard, but they've iterated around that
Right.
versions. We have never done that. Since we went into ISO, we've been rock solid. We never did subversions. We just do our standard and proposed update to it, which makes us a lot slower moving than SPDX. I think that was a board decision to avoid confusion, right? You don't have the non-ISO version to pick up. And the ISO version thus far has taken a slow cadence on updates. So the answer then is, Prasad, it would be a case of there'd be a draft, which wouldn't change much, and there'd be no subversions. So we would be moving at a slower visible cadence than SPDX, though the drafting process before public comment and before freeze would be organic. So again, that would just mean less new versions of our standards. And that would make us different to SPDX, but it would be consistent with how we've acted.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely get it. I think compliance is certainly a more slower evolving function than the SBOM standards as well. So I think yeah, the way they do it in the SPDX, you're absolutely right. I think they churn out, or at least they target to churn out one cycle, and then so I think currently the one that is in production is 2.3, and then now within probably a month or so, I'm hearing they might get the 3.0 out for SPDX, and at which point they will go and attempt that 3.0 to be ISO certified, probably sometime next year, and then later half of next year will probably come out with the subsequent minor version, which is the 3.1 spec. So you're right. I think it moves a little bit faster compared to ours, but that obviously is a different function. So makes sense.
So the question then is, does the steering committee agree with the proposal? 6-month public comment period, 3 months freeze period. That's a change to our process to make it longer and slower. Target cadence communicated as 5 years. And that's not changing anything, but we just be reiterating to the community. And meanwhile, we go back to the specification group and say, good work, we like it. Just this is the new process on top of it. Is the steering committee comfortable with us proceeding that way? And just a reminder, we do need to give some guidance to them because we're going to make them feel awfully lonely if we just do nothing, because they've sent this to us and said, can you approve our year of work? So, yeah, it's a majority vote time. 6-month public comment period, 3 months freeze period, target cadence, 5 years. But spec team, nice work. This is going into that new process. And we love you all.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
All right. No objections. All steering committee members present are with that. We've had 1 or 2 people go, but Kubota-san seemed aligned with the conversation too, so we're going to pretend he said yes.
I want to have one addendum, just don't bury it that much during the freezing period that everyone can see outside. Let's make it really, really public so people can do the evaluation to avoid the Vauban effect.
So Helio's just saying, let's make this public stuff super public. And that actually touches on maybe marketing spend next year. I mean, we can use some of our marketing spend on, I don't know, putting it into LinkedIn to target risk groups and say, hey, you know, this license spec, this security spec has a public period, et cetera, et cetera.
Agreed.
But by the way, my note on LinkedIn there was based on the fact we tried it for things like conformance, didn't work. Conformance works because we went and communicated with companies at events. But something like a public comment period on a spec, maybe we just want to tell people far and wide, heads up, if you care, this is happening. That would also be unique in that I don't think anyone else has done such public communication, but it fits our brand to do something like that. All right, that's it. Steering committee has approved this. No objections. Objections would have been fine. This is basically majority rule, and we're done. Matthew, once again, you get 14 seconds for strategy. Would you like screen share?
Yes. Please.
All righty.
So just to recap, when we were in Bilbao, there was a session that was 2 hours long. We talked about strategy in the future of OpenChain, what we were looking forward to. I will go until the bottom of the hour and then stop. There are 2 things I want to get out of this session. One is about continuing the strategy meetings, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also the AI study group that was brought up in the board meeting. I kind of want to get some commitment to kind of run that. So going back to the concept of the strategy meeting, we had the first one in Bilbao. Like I said, it was 2 hours after the board meeting. We discussed a lot of things from the future of tooling to AI, and we had a deep dive session into AI ethics, which was all good and very helpful, and the whole purpose of the strategy meeting. We have 15 minutes here today, so what I'm proposing is that we continue having a strategy session after a governing board meeting at a quarterly cadence, and then maybe even extending some sessions to being a work group. Jimmy, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just to add to a proposal, because we have had many board members expressing a willingness to host a meeting outside of our normal face-to-face cadence connected to an LF event. So proposal, we're not in the board now, so it's not a decision-making proposal, but for you to noodle on is, my proposal is that we extend it, do another in-person board meeting, have that hosted by a board member company, volunteers welcome, and then extend the strategy session for longer, possibly 4, 5, 6 hours afterwards, so that we really have time to deep dive on topics. That would probably add to people's travel burden and travel schedule. I still think it's valuable. I still think both the strategy session and the board meeting, of course, will make that available via Teams for those who are not able. And we'll try to rotate that between various geographical locations, so that everyone is equally unhappy at some time in terms of the timing. But I think that from seeing what we had in Bilbao, that was sort of really great for the board to be able to have those discussions. I found them very valuable. And it's clear that we never have enough time for strategy doing it like this, because we always have the rest of the LF event we all want to get back to, because that's one of the reasons we're here. So having a dedicated face-to-face board meeting and strategy session not connected to an LF event might be valuable.
Any comments? Okay. No,
At least no objections to
at
it.
least no objections. Okay. The other area I wanted to discuss was AI study group, which has been previously brought up before. We kind of spent a large amount of that last strategy session sort of talking about AI and what we can benefit from. We've already heard today earlier from Qualcomm, Sony, about the fact that we have AI sort of working groups or policies or procedures that are starting to form. My company, we're doing that with an AI office and a policy and procedures. And to Dave's point earlier, it's kind of part of the OpenChain is really to help everybody out, reduce that burden in the whole supply chain. And there's no point in my company trying to come up with a procedure that's different to other companies, because then we're not talking the same language. So what I would like to propose in this study group, or part of the study group, is we kind of have a look at some of these procedures and policies that we can see if we can harmonize and see if we can benefit from, like we have with the licensing and the security standards.
Referring to open source AI, what is that mean?
So that's still to be defined, and I think the first session of that study group would be to have a bit more of a deeper dive into what that group wants to try and figure out, what we want to do for OpenChain. And part of this session, I know we've only got a few minutes, was to kind of suggest ideas of AI. I've got a picture on my screen for those of you who do have it. It was kind of touched on before, and don't worry if you haven't got it, I'll describe it. Yes, there are models that are large language models. Those open source are very proprietary. We've also got the input, the training data. Is that open source? Is that proprietary? These, depending on your use case of some pictures that are open source license going into a large language model, that's going to have a completely different risk to a say you putting proprietary code into an open source large language model. So there's clearly risks there that we might want to explore and provide guidance or something along those lines. So there's the language models and also the input into those language models that we could consider as well. So just I will open it up for 10 minutes, but what I really like is we're going to form this study group. Dave's going to talk about it tomorrow at the meeting. We've already discussed it before. We kind of wanted to see if we can have a meeting before the end of the year. I don't know how practical that would be, just to kind of define some scope and maybe some cadence of what we want to do in 2024. But it would be good for us to understand, and we can send an email out to the rest of the kind of community who wants to kind of get involved in this. So I don't know if people want to kind of raise their, say that they would like to get involved, and maybe what you're, okay, we've already got hands, and maybe talk about what you would like to get out of this group. So I open that up to discussion for 10 minutes. If you want to be involved in this group and kind of what you wanted to get out of it.
I'm going to go first and saying that what I would like the first thing is really just to define a common understanding of the problems, because I don't even think we have that. So define a common understanding of the problems, then we can try to prioritize among them and try to solve them. So that I would really like to get out of this, and I'd love to be involved. But are you volunteering to share it? To share the study group?
What do you mean share this?
As convener, if you will.
Oh, chair,
Yeah,
chair, well.
Yeah,
that would be
making
subject
sure
to
that
others.
someone distributes the word and ensure that that's calling for the meetings essentially.
I'm more than happy unless anyone else wants to kind of volunteer.
Yeah, this is Prasad. I would like to participate as well. This is just part of our current organization's ongoing initiatives. There are some key aspects when it comes to AI in general, and then obviously generative AI in particular, based dependencies and how that plays into the compliance spectrum. I think that's something that we would like to certainly like get involved and see how we can add value there. Plus, there is also some interest around the usage of some of these GAI or AI generated dependencies. Is there going to be a special preference, or I would say, like, how are we going to handle this when it comes to the broader perspective of community engagement, right? So one of the things that we continue to do is leveraging third parties plus our contributions back to the community. How is that plays into it? So I think we have some value add there. So definitely I would like to be interested in this, joining this study group.
Just to summarize, we've got Prasad interested, Jimmy interested, Dave interested, Mary interested,
Gail on the chat.
Gail interested, and Matthew to take the blame with initial chairing. So that's going to be explorative and see where we go.
Just you need really take care about to avoid the shaving process on this one. It's too big. It's really too big, and we don't have a scope exactly right now. So this is at some point we're starting to touching things on the security, and we're starting to touch things on finances, having it's in everywhere, and then it's becoming out of context. This is the thing. So we need the context, please.
I completely agree. We need to define what we want to try and achieve, but I feel with OpenChain we have so much permeation in so many different industries. We could really lead in this area, and where governments are providing their own jurisdictional requirements and regulations, these can take many years to get through, and we might be able to produce something that people can look to OpenChain as at least a starting point, and it will evolve. It's going to evolve like a lot of the open source software work evolved over decades in the past. So we're not going to solve everything in 6 months, but maybe there's something we can do in 2024 and define something and help people out, and then evolve it and see where it gets to.
So Helio was just pointing out that scoping is a challenge, and Matthew was concurring and saying he sees that we can assist in this area, and talking it through what can be done is good. This brings up something that Endo-san and I briefly talked about in the one-to-one. Endo-san was talking about AI, and you mentioned to me that, again, scope is broad, right? It should be about practical issues. If we find a practical issue, not theory.
Yeah, so I think AI is now buzzword, become buzzword, and everyone interested in that. And there are huge area, not only license, but also security or copyright infringement and so on. So, and other organization, the other standardization also discussion. So how to define our scope and how to count the global standard by 2040. So I think in this there are many license conference people. So and up to focus on some each real practical issues, because our approach is open source approach. So we are not politicians. So we have to start the discussion based on the issues of the open source license compliance of AI. So this is the way.
So Endo-san was reiterating that practical compliance-related activity is important, and I thought a good point there. We're not politicians. It's not our job to go super wide. Mary, Prasad, by the way, your typing is coming through. Could you temporarily mute? Thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I agree with you about the scope. I agree with everyone in the room about, let's not get too wild. I did want to point out that at this spirit conference, as PDX, I learned that they have started I guess work group of some sort. And there's a talk on from the Kubernetes group. They're looking at security in the monolithic supply chain. So these are topics that are very relevant. Doesn't mean you need to rush. It makes sense that we should start talking about this sooner.
So just to summarize what Mary said for the call, she agrees with everyone. But she also made a point that a lot of people are talking about fields like this. So we should keep track of that and also keep it, correct me if I'm wrong, keep a leadership position in understanding these fields.
Yeah, particularly, I mean, everything about it, but I'm noticing at this conference that it's about like some compliance and security, and those are our strengths.
Right. And that's a really good point. I mean, there's a vacuum on this domain, and we might be best placed to contribute to that vacuum, but we're also best placed to do it in a scoped manner, not try to solve AI, but specifically solve for things like license compliance or security, our domain. And we do have informal discussion, like LFAI and data. Abraham's interested in talking. We're already set to put our network to work and not work in isolation. And it's going to be Matthew's job to deal with it. So I'm going to relax.
If everyone is okay with that, of course.
I think we need someone to convene a first meeting at least.
I
and we
can convene a first meeting and we discuss it.
And then you have a chance to escape it after that.
And on that note, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We're going to have to wrap up because
We're just closed.
Okay, we're ready.
Shane, just one quick thing before we drop off. Are you going to send out an invite or later in Jan?
Absolutely. We'll do a very clear invite for the AI study group kickoff call. And that will be communicated clearly to the governing board mailing list. So by the way, everyone, we have succeeded in a new first for OpenChain. We've been thrown out of a hotel. Well done. Well done, everyone.
All right.
Take care, Prasad. Thank you very much for being
you.
on.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.